The moment my neighbor caught me staring through the gap in her backyard fence, I was holding my breath so hard my chest hurt. She stood only a few yards away beneath the bright afternoon sun, one hand gripping the handle of a rusted red wagon, the other pressed against her heart as if she had seen a ghost. I expected anger, embarrassment, maybe even a threat to call the police. Instead, her eyes filled with tears, and she said quietly, "If you want to see, just ask." What she showed me that day was not the secret I had imagined. It was something far more painful, something that forced me to confront the worst mistake of my life. Before we continue, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel if you believe kindness can repair broken hearts, forgiveness can change people, and second chances can arrive when we least expect them. My name is Callum Mercer, and at 38, I had become the kind of man who noticed everything except what truly mattered. I worked from home as an insurance claims investigator, spending my days studying photographs of damaged houses, reading suspicious reports, and searching for details people hoped I would miss. That habit followed me beyond my computer screen. I noticed which neighbors left their trash cans out too long, who parked over the sidewalk, and who watered their lawn during restricted hours. I told myself I was observant. The truth was less flattering. I had become suspicious of everyone because suspicion was easier than trust. 3 years earlier, my wife, Laurel, had left after telling me she could no longer live under the weight of my constant doubt. She said I questioned every late phone call, every changed plan, every quiet expression on her face until our marriage felt like an interrogation room. I blamed her for giving up. Deep inside, however, I knew she had not left because she had something to hide. She had left because I had forgotten how to love someone without examining them for evidence. My new neighbor arrived in early spring, moving into the weathered blue house beside mine. Her name was Rosalie Whitmore, though most people on the street called her Rosie. She appeared to be in her early 40s, with copper-brown hair usually tied loosely behind her head and pale green eyes that carried a permanent trace of exhaustion. She lived alone, rarely had visitors, and spent nearly every sunny day working behind the tall wooden fence separating our yards. At first, I heard only ordinary sounds, a shovel scraping dirt, boards being moved, the wheels of a wagon creaking across the grass. Then the deliveries began. Wooden crates arrived without labels. Large bags of soil were stacked beside her garage. A carpenter came one morning and left carrying pieces of broken furniture. Twice, I saw Rosie unload child-sized chairs from her car even though no children lived with her. She painted them in cheerful colors, then carried them behind the fence. When I waved, she offered a polite smile but never explained what she was doing. I should have minded my own business, but curiosity slowly hardened into suspicion. A former claims investigator knows how easily harmless details can be arranged into a troubling story. Rosie covered part of her backyard with a long canvas canopy. She installed a new lock on the side gate. She received boxes marked with medical supply labels and quickly moved them out of sight. One afternoon, I noticed her standing beside the garage holding a small yellow raincoat against her chest. She closed her eyes and began to cry. When she realized I could see her from my kitchen window, she hurried inside. That should have awakened compassion in me. Instead, it fed the restless part of my mind that believed every unanswered question concealed danger. The situation became more unsettling when I heard children's laughter drifting from her yard during the day. It happened on a warm Tuesday while I was reviewing a roof damage claim. The sound was brief but unmistakable. I walked outside and listened near the fence, but the laughter had stopped. A few minutes later, Rosie's gate opened, and a white van pulled away. There were no markings on it, and its windows were dark. The following Thursday, the van returned. Again, I heard soft voices, wheels rolling over wooden boards, and Rosie encouraging someone in a gentle tone. I considered asking her directly, but direct questions required vulnerability. Suspicion allowed me to remain distant and feel superior. So I searched public records instead. I found that Rosie had previously lived in Vermont, had worked as an elementary school art teacher, and had left her position 2 years earlier. I found no criminal record, no complaints, nothing remotely alarming. Yet rather than accepting that as reassurance, I decided she had simply been careful. My fixation reached its worst point on a clear Saturday afternoon. I had been trimming the hedge along the fence when I heard a child sobbing on the other side. Rosie spoke softly, telling the child it was all right to be afraid and that nobody would force anything. Then I heard a metallic clatter, followed by silence. My imagination exploded with possibilities. I climbed onto the low stone border near the fence and looked through a narrow gap where one board had warped away from the next. I could see only part of Rosie's yard, the edge of the canvas canopy, several bright planters, and a winding wooden platform raised above the grass. A small wheelchair stood empty near a table. Beside it was the red wagon. I leaned closer, trying to see what lay beneath the canopy, and that was when Rosie stepped into view. Her face changed the instant she saw my eye through the fence. Surprise came first, then hurt. She opened the gate and walked into my yard, leaving the wagon behind her. I climbed down, suddenly ashamed, but pride made me defensive. I told her I had heard crying and wanted to make sure everything was all right. She looked at me for a long moment, as though deciding whether I deserved an answer. Then, with tears gathering in her eyes, she said, "If you want to see, just ask." There was no accusation in her voice. Somehow, that made it worse. I followed her through the gate, bracing myself for whatever secret waited beyond the fence. Her backyard was not dangerous. It was beautiful. Beneath the canvas canopy stood a miniature garden designed for children with serious illnesses and physical disabilities. The wooden platforms formed wheelchair-accessible paths through raised flower beds. Small tables held paintbrushes with specially adapted grips. Wind chimes hung low enough for seated children to reach. There were sensory walls covered in smooth stones, ribbons, bells, and pieces of soft fabric. The medical boxes contained gloves, wipes, feeding supplies, and emergency equipment donated by a pediatric care organization. The child-sized chairs were arranged around a mosaic table decorated with suns and birds. At the center of the garden stood a young apple tree surrounded by painted stones, each carrying a child's name. Rosie explained that she hosted small daytime visits for children receiving long-term hospital treatment. Some came from a nearby rehabilitation center, while others were brought by parents who needed a safe outdoor place where their children would not feel stared at or excluded. The unmarked van belonged to a volunteer transport service. The locked gate protected medical privacy. The child I had heard crying had been frightened to leave his wheelchair and try the supported garden swing. Rosie had not pressured him. She had simply sat nearby until he felt safe enough to watch another child use it. I wanted to disappear. Every detail I had interpreted as suspicious had been evidence of kindness. Rosie had built a place where children who spent their lives surrounded by hospital walls could feel sunlight on their faces, touch soil, paint, laugh, and be treated as children rather than patients. I apologized, but the word sounded small. I admitted I had been watching her for weeks. I confessed that I had searched her background. Her expression tightened, and for the first time, anger appeared beneath her sadness. She told me that being curious was human, but choosing suspicion over a simple conversation was a decision. She said people often looked through fences because fences allowed them to create stories without facing the people inside them. Then Rosie walked toward the apple tree and touched the yellow raincoat hanging from one of its lower branches. She explained that it had belonged to her daughter, Maren. At 8 years old, Maren had developed a rare neurological illness that gradually took away her ability to walk, speak clearly, and perform ordinary tasks. Rosie had left teaching to care for her. During Maren's final year, she often asked to sit in the garden, but most parks were difficult to navigate with her wheelchair, and crowded spaces made her feel uncomfortable. Rosie promised that one day she would create a garden where children like Maren would never feel like burdens. Maren died before the garden could exist. The yellow raincoat remained because she had loved sitting outside after summer rain, watching drops shine on leaves. I stared at the painted stones around the tree and felt something inside me break open. One stone bore Marin's name in fading gold letters. Another carried the words, "You still belong in the sunshine." Rosie said she did not tell many people the full story because sympathy could become another form of staring. She wanted the garden to be about the children who came there, not about her grief. Then she asked why I had been so determined to believe the worst about her. For once, I answered honestly. I told her about Laurel, about the marriage I had destroyed by confusing vigilance with love. My father had abandoned our family when I was 12, leaving behind unpaid bills and promises that meant nothing. Afterward, my mother taught me to expect disappointment because she believed preparation could prevent pain. I carried that lesson into adulthood. When Laurel loved me, I looked for the moment she would stop. When she needed privacy, I treated it like secrecy. When she tried to reassure me, I searched her words for inconsistencies. Eventually, I created the betrayal I feared, not because she was unfaithful, but because I made trust impossible. Since then, I had turned suspicion into a shield, pretending it protected me when it had only kept me alone. Rosie listened without interrupting. She did not excuse my behavior, but she did not humiliate me either. She said grief often teaches people the wrong lesson. Her grief could have taught her never to love deeply again because love had made losing Marin unbearable. Instead, she chose to let that love become a shelter for other children. My grief had taught me to keep everyone under suspicion so no one could surprise me with pain. She told me that both choices came from fear, but only one created something worth living inside. That I left her yard that afternoon carrying more shame than I knew how to hold. For several days, I avoided my windows and stayed indoors. I drafted an apology letter, deleted it, and wrote another. Each version sounded like an attempt to make myself feel better. Finally, I walked next door in the late morning and asked Rosie whether the garden needed any repairs. She studied me carefully and said one of the wheelchair ramps had begun to warp. She did not offer immediate forgiveness. She simply handed me a measuring tape. That ramp became the first honest thing I had built in years. I replaced the warped boards, reinforced the railing, and added a smooth edge so small wheels would not catch. Rosie watched quietly at first, still unsure whether my help came from guilt or genuine change. Over the following weeks, I repaired loose planters, built storage benches, and installed shade panels. I never entered the yard without permission. I stopped asking for personal information about the children. When visitors arrived, I stayed in my own yard unless Rosie invited me to assist. Slowly, she began to trust that I was learning the difference between concern and intrusion. One afternoon, a 10-year-old boy named Everett arrived with his grandmother. He had recently lost part of his left leg after a severe infection and refused to participate in physical therapy. He sat beneath the canopy with his arms crossed, glaring at the garden as though it had personally offended him. Rosie did not force him to join the other children. She asked whether he would help judge which birdhouse was strongest. Everett examined 3 birdhouses, then pointed out that one roof was crooked. Rosie called me over and said I was responsible for construction. Everett looked at me with open disapproval. Instead of defending myself, I admitted I had measured badly. He asked for a screwdriver. By the end of the visit, he had repaired the roof while seated at the work table. The next week, he returned and asked to build another birdhouse from scratch. Watching him changed me. Everett did not need pity. He needed usefulness, choice, and the dignity of being taken seriously. Rosie understood that instinctively because she had learned it from Marin. I began volunteering regularly, not as an investigator, not as someone searching for hidden explanations, but as a person willing to be present. I learned how to adjust table heights, how to speak to children without staring at their medical equipment, and how to let silence exist without filling it with questions. The garden became a place where I practiced trust in small, uncomfortable steps. Rosie and I grew closer, but our friendship did not erase what I had done. One day, she admitted that after catching me at the fence, she had considered closing the garden. She feared I might report her, expose the children's identities, or spread rumors. For 2 years, she had fought zoning questions, insurance requirements, and neighbors who worried about parking. My behavior made her wonder whether continuing was worth the risk. Hearing that nearly crushed me. My suspicion had not merely insulted her, it had almost destroyed a sanctuary built from a mother's grief. I asked what I could do to make amends beyond repairing boards. Rosie said the garden needed official nonprofit status and better community support. Using my experience with documentation, I helped organize records, safety procedures, donation receipts, and liability forms. I attended a neighborhood meeting and publicly admitted that I had misjudged Rosie. I explained what the garden actually provided while protecting every child's privacy. It was humiliating to confess how wrong I had been, but humiliation was not the same as harm. Sometimes embarrassment is simply the price of becoming accountable. The neighborhood's attitude shifted. A retired nurse offered to volunteer. A hardware store donated lumber. A local bakery began providing snacks for families. Laurel, whom I had not spoken to in nearly a year, heard about the garden through a mutual friend. She sent a box of art supplies and a brief note saying she was glad I had found something that required trust rather than investigation. I read that sentence several times. Then I wrote back not to ask for another chance, not to defend the past, but to apologize without expectation. I told her she had been right about the way I treated her. I thanked her for the patience she had shown and said I hoped her life had become peaceful. Several weeks later, Laurel replied. She said forgiveness did not mean returning to what had been broken, but she was grateful I had finally understood. Her message hurt, yet it also freed me. For years, I had imagined redemption as receiving back everything I lost. Rosie helped me understand that redemption sometimes means accepting the consequences while refusing to remain the person who caused them. By late summer, the garden was officially registered as the Marin Sunshine Project. During the small daytime dedication ceremony, children painted handprints on a new wooden sign. Everett arrived using a prosthetic leg and insisted on standing long enough to attach the final birdhouse to its post. Rosie wore Marin's yellow raincoat even though the afternoon was warm. When she addressed the families, her voice trembled, but she smiled. She said the garden had begun as a promise to one child and survived because an entire community decided that no child should feel hidden behind a fence. After everyone left, Rosie and I stood beside the apple tree while sunlight moved through the leaves. She told me she had forgiven me. Not because I deserved to have the past erased, but because I had faced it honestly and chosen to change. I thanked her for opening the gate when she could have closed it forever. She said perhaps both of us had needed that gate opened. She had been protecting the garden so fiercely that she had forgotten help could come from unexpected people. I had been looking through fences because I was afraid to knock. That day taught me that the stories we invent about others often reveal more about our wounds than their character. Suspicion can make us feel intelligent, cautious, and protected, but it can also blind us to extraordinary goodness standing only a few feet away. Trust does not require ignoring danger. It requires the humility to ask before accusing, to listen before judging, and to admit when fear has distorted what we see. Before this story ends, leave a meaningful comment about a time when kindness changed your opinion of someone, or share what forgiveness means to you. Your words may remind another person that growth is possible even after a painful mistake. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. That I still live beside Rosie, and the fence between our yards remains standing. We never removed it, because boundaries are not the enemy. The problem was never the fence. The problem was my belief that looking through a crack gave me the right to decide what existed on the other side. Now, when I hear children laughing beneath the afternoon sun, I do not search for hidden explanations. I wait for the gate to open. Some days Rosie calls me over to repair a toy, steady a planter, or help Everett with another birdhouse. Other days, I simply listen from my own yard and feel grateful that joy lives nearby. Above the gate hangs a small wooden sign painted in Marin's favorite shade of yellow. It reads, "You still belong in the sunshine." Every time I pass it, I remember that second chances do not always arrive as grand miracles. Sometimes they begin with a person you have wronged looking directly at you and saying, with more grace than you deserve, "If you want to see, just ask."